Hi, welcome back to the Ygartua Art Chronicles podcast, where we discover the amazing life and career of Paul Ygartua. Today we're going to chat with Joanne Ygartua about her growing up and her path to eventually meeting Paul. Well, hello, Joanne. How are you?
Very great. Doing well over here in what we call Vancouver, the balmy West Coast.
So last week, or the week before, we talked to Paul about his background and his growing up. And so Paul is the painter, obviously, but the whole Ygartua Art Chronicles wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you as well, because you play an equally important part of the whole artistic, creative.
Well, I'm a bit of a fact checker.
Yeah.
So I've got the facts.
So if we go back and we kind of cover your origins and your background, you're equally as interesting, I think, really. And a lot of Canadians, I guess, have roots outside Canada, of course. So your roots come from England.
Yes. It's sort of like a endless circle with England and Canada. We just keep going round and round. But my grandparents on my father's side, they were my grandmother from London and my grandfather was from Cornwall. But my grandmother's family, actually, they were missionaries in South Africa in the 1800s. They're quite religious on that her side. And everybody was in business. Everybody was, they were the great adventurers. That's sort of my connection to wanting, I guess. I come from a family that were always searching out new lands. And my grandmother with her four sisters, they were all teachers in London, and the father had sent them out to the New World.
Wow.
And my grandmother met my grandfather. He was an engineer, and I believe also that he was first in Alberta. I don't know about searching or finding any gold, but I think they thought about that in those days as well, the gold rush days.
Mm.
They met in 1902, and then they arrived in Vancouver in 1904.
Wow.
And then my father was born in 1914 in Point Grey. If anybody's from this area, they know like Kitsilane and Point Grey and our Stanley Park, and this is all within 5-10 minutes. The waterfront is right there, the seawall. If you're a nature lover, then Vancouver, really, British Columbia is the place. It seems to have everything.
So your grandparents met. Did they meet? They met in Canada. Did they? They met in Vancouver, or
They
met in Alberta?
Calgary.
In Calgary.
Yeah, in Alberta.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was sort of turn of the century, almost 120 years ago. So a long time ago, a very different place.
I always consider, of course, we are like new Canadians. Because we've only been here just over 100 years. And, come on, our natives, the first people of Canada, thousands of years before. And right here in Vancouver, when my father was born in 1914 in Point Grey, I understood that they owned the third house there, and it was like being in the middle of a forest.
Yeah.
And of course, the whole place was just a forest. And it was mainly the British that settled here. In the eastern part of Canada, we have the French. They were the first settlers. I think they came as early as 1600, but in the 1700s, you had more of the French that came in.
And so your grandmother would have come over to teach?
Yeah, her ancestors from the 1800s, they were missionaries, but my grandmother was a teacher. They were all teachers, the four girls. And The others stayed back in Alberta. It was only my grandmother meeting my grandfather
Hmm.
in Calgary that they got married, and then they came to the West Coast.
And so your dad was born in Vancouver. And what about your mum? What was your mum's
Well, then my
backstory?
father, this is what I keep saying, we just keep going in circles. Because of the Second World War, my father joined up in the army, and he was stationed in Birmingham, England.
Oh, was he?
And that's where he met my mother. And they married just at, I guess, just before the end of the war in Birmingham.
Did he see any action?
No, it's funny. My father, he was very fortunate. He ended up working for the medical corps. They needed, I don't know how my father got typing skills in shorthand, but I think they all learned those sort of things years back. But he was very good at that, and he would have gone with the squadron to Italy. Most of them did die, and just before he left, the medical corps said, "Hey, anybody that can type shorthand, anything." Well, my father said, "Well, I can," and they said, "Okay, you got to stay behind." So
Wow.
I believe that saved his life.
Yeah, that's true. And your mum was doing what at the same time?
Well, my mother was at 16, during the war. I guess that was the age that they took them in the factories, and they were, making everything for, I don't know if it's from bombs to, maybe fitting little pieces or what they were doing, but everything to help the war. Everybody was obligated to work.
That's right, yeah. And so, as you said, you're saying things are going around in circles. You're right. It's England to Canada, back to England, and then I imagine at some point back to Canada again. Is that right? I mean, they met there.
Right, yeah.
They met in Birmingham. They got married, and what happened next?
And then my father, of course, with all the troops, first came home. And then his bride, she was, classified as a war bride. And all the war brides, shipped all over the world, I guess. They did have a lot of good times during the war. They also were entertained by the British ladies, my mother being included. And so they had the big boat that took them to, I think, Montreal. Like the war brides came, I think, a couple of months after. And then then they took the train from Montreal to Vancouver, and my mother arrived here in Vancouver, I think, right at the end. It was probably in the September of 1945.
And so your father was coming back to his roots, I guess that's it. And
that's right.
Yeah.
His parents, living still in Point Grey, and my grandfather had one of the first real estate companies here in Vancouver. And, I'm not sure if I don't think she was teaching at that time, because my father was born and he had a sister and a brother, and I guess she was busy in those days. The women, would be at home taking care of the family.
Yeah. And so your father, through his life, he ended up running a business, which ended up being quite important to you eventually. We'll get to that later, but explain a bit about what happened.
My father, in the early 50s, he bought 18 quarries in the United States, marble quarries. He bought a plant, that's where they have the quarries. And he was working previously for Bill McBay, who had the plant. And then McBay wanted to sell it, and my father bought it. So he had already, I think, been working with Bill for maybe 5 or 6 years previously. And this was, I was, maybe I was six or seven at that time. And my father, everything was business. So I did grow up in a household that, my father was involved in the arts and business. and that was always it. He was every other week out of Vancouver, driving down to the United States or taking the plane down there. And the plant was just outside Spokane, Washington. So it used to take him 8 hours by car.
Wow.
He used to go down the Oregon coast and then cross over to Spokane. And then Chewelah was the plant, the very small town. And that was, I think, an hour from Spokane.
And because you moved around a fair bit when you were young, why were you moving so much? Because of his business, or?
Well, no, I never moved, but it was only traveling with my father and my mother just down to the States. But like when I was 4, my mother was very homesick. And so we did go back to England to visit her family, as they had never met me. And we crossed Canada again by train, and then again 7 days on the boat. And maybe I'm not sure if it arrived in Southampton, maybe. And we were there for a few months.
Wow.
But other than that, it was trips down to California. My father's business contacts were across North America. So, they were from New York to Los Angeles to all up the coast, going into Calgary. So mainly the travel was, we would be with him on a business trip. So we would just combine, pleasure with business. I just loved so much, like, being there, like being in another country, even though they're just our neighbors.
Yeah.
And then even the Mexican area was just the music and the color was so exciting. And
so when you were your father's work was kind of there was a side to it that was extremely businesslike and practical and making deals and sales and producing stuff, but at the same time, because it was marble, I guess, and granite and things like that. It was naturally linked with sort of very creative people from, as you said, New York and Los Angeles, which was, culturally interesting and very exciting. So that's where that side, that creative side comes from, or that's where you got exposure to sort of.
That's true. That exposure, and I never thought of that throughout the years. In fact, the last thing I ever wanted to do was work for my father. But at 17, I had my aunt and uncle from Birmingham that came over. And they spent a month with us. And I was certainly never thinking of going to England either, or traveling on my own to England. But after 1 month, they said, hey, why don't you, save up your money for a couple of years, get a job, and you can come over and work in Birmingham. And so that changed my direction. I wasn't sure what direction at that point, but at 17, I was right after I graduated from high school. My father said, look, I can fit you in now. You can work from the Vancouver office. And I said, oh, okay, because I'm going to save my money, and I'm going to leave when I'm 20 for England. And that was my plan, and once I make a plan, I always stick to the plan.
Good.
So, of course, it was interesting every day because the plant superintendent, there's always things going on, or urgently needs my father for this, or a shipment has not arrived in New York, or we need money for the payroll Friday. So you'd have to be calling New York, or you'd have to be talking to people in LA, I really didn't think about it, but I was exposed to all these different cities, which it was certainly interesting, and I was very grateful to my father for that opportunity.
Have you got brothers and sisters, and did they?
No.
No. Okay,
I'm an only child.
So you were the eyes were all on you.